Welcome to the Last American Vagabond. I have Scott C. Smith joining me today to talk about East Palestine, something that we've been talking about quite a lot. That's been one of the most horrendous situations, one of the most obvious cover-ups, in my opinion, that I've ever seen in my life. And it's a really astounding situation to see after 4 months that we're still having this conversation, not about how that we should be focusing on what happened, but that we're still even disputing. People are debating whether this is even something that happened. It's kind of blowing my mind. So joining me again today is Scott C. Smith, Chief Sustainability Officer at ECO Integrated Technologies, Inc., and one of the few independent experts that are on the ground in East Palestine, exposing the ongoing cover-up by the EPA and Norfolk Southern. So, Scott, thank you for joining me today, taking the time. I know you're very busy. How are you?
Great. Really appreciate you having me, Ryan, and these longer form segments in the media. And it's people like you that are going to make the media honest again. So much appreciated.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that, man. And yeah, I mean, your work is so very important on the ground that so few are doing, which is it's kind of staggering to me that hasn't happened more. But I know why people are afraid to kind of rock the boat these days. But let's get into a lot of different things today about the risks and so on. But I want to kind of start with, so you're not involved with this, and something obviously caught your attention. So what was it that made you go, I'm going to go there and check this out?
Yeah, well, what I have done, this is probably approaching my 70th disaster. And
wow,
a little bit of background. You can see on my pinned Twitter, my pinned Facebook, it's the history. 17 years ago, I was wiped out in oil contaminated floodwaters in 2006. And everything, my business, 100 employees, I've walked the streets not knowing where anything is going to come to next. First thing I did is, try to, when you walk the streets and you see employees and people that not knowing how they're going to feed their babies, get baby formula, that profoundly affects you. So the insurance company declared my factory in a basement and did not pay. So I liquidated my life, my life savings, put everything back. We recovered. And in this 500-year flood in 2006 in upstate New York, there was oil contaminated floodwaters everywhere. And the white booms, the white sorbents, nothing was working. And I had a medical foam, a special foam in the corner that had a FDA approval, and the military was using, believe it or not, for our first responders and also military. In the event there's a sarin gas or a toxic gas attack, it's infused with a lotion. And it was the only material in the world that would not deactivate the lotion. And if your skin is exposed to attack, you scrub it down and you live. That started sucking up all the oil where nothing else was. So I decided if I was going to liquidate my life, restart over again, I became obsessed with oil and water and started using this technology. It was in the corner of my factory and building it out. So roll forward to 2010. I see BP. I reach out to BP and, no one's getting back to me. So I went down with a duffel bag, chartered my own boat, little fishing boat. And fishermen said, thousands of people before you, happy to take your money. Threw him my iPhone. I think it was an iPhone 2 or 3 at the time. I don't remember. And he's turned white as I started scrubbing, taking this material, and the oil started coming off. And then BP reached out to me, and then BP endorsed what I did in the technology. And that's really how I had an existing business wiped out in oil contaminated floodwaters. And that was kind of the birth of my, remediation technology. So that's where I learned back in 2010 at the BP about that's when I was naive when it came to sustainability. So in BP, actually, the people at BP were great. And that's where I found out Republicans, Democrats, elected officials. I can tell you, I sat at a Ritz-Carlton meeting, Mary Landrieu, senator, and all this stuff. I refused. They should do the right thing. I shouldn't have to, and I just refused. But that's where I was told, well, we're not, BP bought a few $1 million. It could have been hundreds of millions, but I'm too stubborn. I'm under a lot of stress. That's why I sleep at night, and I got to be able to look myself in the mirror. I will not participate in that kind of pay to play scheme, whether legal or not. I abhor it, what's going on. So that's when I didn't pay to play, and I ended up having some death threats against me, and BP was great in protecting me. And I don't, and I fear nothing doing this kind of work. Um, and that's when I realized I had oil spill contractors and even elected officials were never going to use your technology after BP endorsed it. It may have saved the shorelines from being burned. We don't want to get the oil out of the water quickly. We're all tied to the landfills. The more trips to the landfill we make. So hence the sustainability thing. And as I started this path, then I started going into all these other contamination events, Mayflower, Arkansas, water contamination, chemical spills, because I realized that, if I could help communities not have to go through what I went through my own disaster, I mean, my life will never be the same again. But we recovered and going to disasters and help people understand what's in their water. When you see this kind of corruption firsthand, it changed. And like I said, I'm pretty stubborn and passionate about it. So I started going to all these different disasters, and roll forward to East Palestine. I had somebody a resident reach out on Twitter and said, "Would you please come help me?" And I usually get called in, or a community or somebody to call in. And when I joined last year, I joined a company. I'm involved in multiple companies. I'm CEO of 2 other companies that I own, but I'm also involved. Have you seen stuff about toxic algae?
In a general sense, yeah, I'm actually really interested in that. And the real.
Yeah, I'm heavily involved. I'll send you emails separately on that because we've got a lot to talk about. Yeah. But I'm heavily involved in Florida, and nutrient that's a big threat to the human race because of excess nutrients. So last year I sold a couple of my patents. I have about 24 to a company called Eco Integrated Technologies, and they wanted me to join as chief sustainability officer. And part of the terms of my employment, I said to them, I want to continue to go into these disasters. I want to set a new model for corporate citizenship. Maybe corporations should do the right thing for the communities. Not fun. Do the right thing. No strings attached. I want a budget. I want to go in if there's a contamination event. And, I believe if you really mean what you say, individually or a corporation, when it comes to sustainability, if the health of a community like East Palestine isn't sustainable, I don't really think anything else matters. If you don't have your health and you're getting cancer, does it matter whether or not you use a plastic straw? I don't think so.
All right.
So in starting to set a new rule for that, I went in there and started testing, and that's, now I've made 8 trips out there, and the expression is, you can't find what you don't look for. Right. I can't believe something so simple has really generated, so many sound bites, but if you can't find what you don't look for, and I do feel very positively about East Palestine. It is like a tipping point. In all the disasters I've been to, I've never had so many experts reach out to me. For example, I have 5 experts, over 150 years of experience. 4 of them have to remain nameless. You'd probably recognize them in their institutions, but it's pretty sad that we live in the United States of America and people have to fear for their jobs for trying to get to the science. All the talk we have about follow the science.
Right.
And when you truly want to follow the science, people have to live in fear for their, but because of the media and because of journalists like yourself, Dr. Beatrice Gullum was able to find me. I did not know who she was. And and you've seen the press release that we put out. She reached out to me, and why she's so important is the burn pits in the Gulf War.
Right.
Believe it or not, it's easy to believe. Our government was telling the vets that it's mass psychosis, perfectly safe levels, you're fine. And what she was able to do is talk about, it's not a singular exposure to a singular chemical. It's how all these chemicals mix together. And she was able to help and diagnose all that. But until East Palestine, We've had some other events in the U.S. with dioxins.
Mhm.
Yeah, but nothing like an intentional burn after a derailment. So we effectively have, for the first time in the continental United States, a burn pits similar to the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point for people. And really quickly on your point about you can't find what you don't look for, I think the reason that got so much attention, and rightly so, is because it's an easy thing for people to understand. The average person sees that, and it's a very clear example: corruption. Right?
Yep.
Knowingly avoiding things you don't want to find. And that's a really important point. But I actually just did a focus on the burn pits in the context of, the larger discussion. And that's just one part of it, but showing that this is a real, I actually went over a couple different studies, one from in regard to the Arctic, and a town in the Arctic that has high levels of dioxins in mother's breast milk, despite the fact that they don't have any dioxin sources within 500 kilometers, and they prove that it came from American sources, and all these different overlaps. And so it's a really important conversation. So I'm glad you bring that up, because it's been a long track record. So please continue on the dioxin side.
Right. I mean, and all these, see, this train that with this controlled burn, the other thing is the weather patterns that day. And the team of experts I have, we're developing an interactive map, and I'd love to come back and give you updates. It's not,
Please.
we're taking all my testing and developing an interactive map. And when that burn was happening, there was a thermal inversion, which is the worst thing that could happen for the plume. It did not move. It just kind of hovered over the ground. And I am no weather expert. I'm no mapping expert, and I'm really appreciative and very glad to have these people around me. And I think this will be very telling. But the other thing is, for every 10 chemicals, you have 1,000 different combinations. There's about 50 different chemicals. So think about that, 50,000 different all the standards in the US are based on basically, like OSHA, it does not assume that you're exposed 24/7 and a singular exposure to a singular chemical. So it is completely disingenuous. And it's a false narrative when and let there be no doubt, the PR people and the lobbyists are in charge, and it's unfortunate the power they wield over the agencies. It's got to change. So citing a singular exposure to a single chemical or saying things are safe is just simply not accurate whatsoever, because there are no standards. And that's why we're doing what we can with the blood testing and other testing. And I'm taking my ground results. And also, it's unfortunate, but I think that we're the only ones. I'm the only one looking for dioxins in well water, soil, and sediment. And we're accumulating a lot of data. And also, we have been able to accumulate control data where the plume was not. And there's something called a fingerprint, whether it's dioxins or these other chemicals. And the fingerprint is different, meaning the mix of chemicals identified, whether dioxins or not, in the plume impacted area versus the non-plume impacted area. And that's a big deal.
Right. I was actually just going over that local report, which is one of the few people covering that, showing that exact point and talking about what you're finding. So I think it's clear that it's your opinion, and tell me if I'm wrong, that they're well aware of this problem and just actively gaslighting people as the comparative point to the burn pits in Iraq and elsewhere. Is that how you feel?
Yeah, I think the words coming out of the PR people calling all the shots, and from some of the agencies too, I don't think it's opinion. It's you're watching them. I've been there listening, saying it's psychosomatic, it's stress. Well, women's menstrual, what just happened, women's menstrual cycles becoming very painful, heavy blooding, heavy clotting, rashes, people having seizures. I don't even need to do any testing to know none of these symptoms were ubiquitous in the East Palestine and its surrounding communities prior to the train incident. Something is going on there. So for PR people affiliated with the railroad to be orchestrating this narrative where it's just stress, clotting, blood, that doesn't come from stress. Little kids peeing blood, having kidney issues, that's not stress.
Right, right. Now, one thing that I have, like, if you want to comment on this, please feel free, but because it's a whole another conversation. But one thing I find interesting is a lot of those symptoms you're describing are also, in my opinion, being covered up in regard to the injections that are being given. And so it's an interesting kind of overlap. And I don't know how we would even kind of piece that out. But either way, your main point is that simply it wasn't there before. This happened. And now they're all suffering kind of this large, it seems kind of ubiquitous, different types of symptoms, but it seems like the entire area is similarly saying we feel different today. We can't think straight and all these different things. And then you got the more severe things you just described. I don't know how anybody honest cannot see that there's something going on. It's kind of mind blowing.
Yeah, and for me, follow the science. I think everyone's familiar with that term. And science should not be politicized or controlled by information officers.
Right.
And I tell all the government agencies, the railroad, everybody, open invitation to test side by side with me, split samples. But when you start, why do you need a public information officer? You shouldn't, because there are a lot of great, don't get me wrong, I've been doing this for a long time and oversaid they're the workers at the EPA, great, honest, ethical people, but their hands get tied. Their hands get tied because of the undue influence from the $50-100 billion company that has all the lobbyists and PR people.
Right.
But there's a change. There's people coming together in a way I haven't seen, like journalists like yourself, asking questions, not going away. Very smart community. I've never had so many experts reach out. And, now with Dr. Beatrice Gullum reaching out and forming an alliance with me to test, it's very hard. It's going to be almost impossible for the PR people on the other side of this to undermine what we're doing.
I wholeheartely agree. I would say that's already the case and already has been. So it's only going to become more difficult for them to keep this under wraps. But it's definitely on the surface. And I think average people can see this. And it's like any other conversation we're seeing right now. It's basically all the facts that you can prove versus just what they say. And I don't know how that continues to float, but it's kind of amazing. We're in a very controlled flow of information. But so what was your first indication? So you're on the ground, just you're not sure what you're going to find. And what was your first indication that people were being misled?
Well, it's the fact that, it's not spreading. And I go myself as almost like a human and I volunteer to do this. So it's not a big deal to me, but I can tell you, I'm used to getting in and out quickly of these disasters, being exposed to oil here and there, not for extended periods of times. Yeah, you get dizzy and everything, but this was unlike anything I've ever experienced because it would take me 48 to 72 hours after every time I went to East Palestine. Sore throat, scratchy, everything that the residents are describing, they're not making it up. And again, I do this, I volunteer, no big deal. But again, with all the health symptoms and what I experienced, I really don't need to see my testing results to know that something is going on. Right. But people are still getting sick. And they're usually at this time after an event, things subside. It is not. People are getting sicker. And what are we, 3 or 4 months into this?
Yeah, 4 months. And so let's focus on that for a second. So this brings me back to the point about the so-called controlled burn. Are we in agreement that that was not a controlled burn? That, like, by definition, the flow of oxygen was not there? So that, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and again, the experts that they will be coming forward eventually. It's my and again, I'm not an expert when it comes to controlled burns, but the people around me that have reached out are. Mm-hmm. And if I understand them correctly, there wasn't even a need for the controlled burn because there's an endothermic reaction going on, and they're accumulating data why the trigger was pulled on the explosion. It's all going to come out, and the NTSB is looking into this, and they have been in communication with that. But we still don't know. They're kind of pointing the fingers at each other. Right. We still don't know who really made the decision and pulled the trigger on the controlled burn. There are people out there saying it may not have been necessary. I'm not saying that as Scott Smith. I'm listening. And again, when you follow the science in a normal world, which we are unfortunately not in these days, when you follow the science, it's about debate, and you go back and forth in a professional way without demonizing anybody. And if we follow the science here, we need to understand what happened because this will be scientifically explained.
Right. Well, I can't wait to hear that information. But so this brings us to the part about the way that went down, right? So in my opinion, and based on, again, the experts I'm speaking to as well, it seems very clear to them that this was the opposite of controlled. You know, they dumped it on the ground. There was no ground cover, burned with no oxygen control. And so obviously that led to, and why don't you tell me what you think that amounts to? Obviously it leads into the ground, right? So more than just dioxins that were produced by the byproduct, what's the real risk there? And that's what I'm getting to what you said before about how I find it absolutely unreal that people are 4 months later, you step in there and get that immediate reaction. That clearly there's still something going on, not just the dioxin potential, or I don't know, maybe you tell me as the expert.
I first got there in February, like 3 to 4 weeks afterwards. And the dioxins, the SVOCs, and the whole list of chemicals, there were oil, heavy oil, tanker cars. It was a concoction of toxic chemicals that I've never quite seen over 60 disasters. And then they lit it on fire, put it into the air in the dust. So it's going everywhere.
Oh, wow. Hold on a second. So you're saying that before the burn, there was already this concoction of chemicals swirling around?
No. When it derailed on February 3rd, I didn't get there to start testing till February 24th. Okay. But when it derailed, there was a concoction of chemicals that were spilling into Sulphur Run, into the creek, into the air. The volatile organic compounds like benzene, semi-volatile, and then you got dioxins. And my point is the mix of these, this toxic cocktail was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. We don't know how these chemicals are combining. And then, you know, the controlled burn, I think, lasted for 3 or 4 days. And then they intentionally light it on fire. So when you light things on fire, chemicals combine, things go airborne. There's a whole host that's why the fingerprint, it's like, unfortunately, it's like a murder scene or a crime scene. So we need to understand the blood type or the fingerprint. It's not about the levels, because when I showed up 4 weeks later, it's about what is present, what should not be there, how did these combine?
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about that specifically, though. That the mixing. I mean, that's such a obviously valid point, and it's amazing to me that that's something that they're. I mean, it's not really. Again, we've seen how they've been operating, but it's shocking to see that they wouldn't address that. The obvious possibility of these things mixing and causing other new problems. But so, let's go into what you found specifically, and then the dioxin specifically, because I've really been focusing on the TCDD and that the risk and the levels and the historic discussion. So one, do you think that the dioxins alone are at a dangerous level? We've seen a lot of reporting on that, and then go into the mixing and what you think that might actually be causing.
Dioxin and dangerous levels of dioxin is debated in the medical community. So, but I can tell you this, there's something called body burden. I can tell you, you know, I'm used to doing this, and dioxins are the fentanyl of chemicals. Well, they're measured in parts per quadrillion. I've never measured anything in parts per quadrillion before. I'm used to parts per billion. Right. And sometimes parts per trillion. So, you know, quadrillion is 1,000 trillion. So those are very minute. It doesn't, and then there's every human has a different body burden. Dioxins don't just readily go away. You just don't pee them out. You just don't exhale them like some of these other contaminants. So, you know, that's why the combining of all these things. So I can't tell you what there may not be a so-called safe level of dioxins that you can broadly say. Every human's different. What's safe for you, what's safe for me, depending on our life history and what our body burden or what our baseline dioxin buildup is from years of being on the planet. We just don't know.
See, that's a really important point. And just to since I mentioned these, I went over this. This is a report from the year 2000, and this is the discussion of it's Nunavut, Arctic Canada, and these are women who they're finding above the considered safe level of dioxins in their breast milk. And as you can see in the title, it's from North American sources. That's what they found, and they found that it was coming from sources all the way from the United States and ending up in this this Arctic area, and they had no dioxin sources within 500 kilometers. And so, right there, it shows you that dioxins can travel a long ways after going airborne. And then to that exact point, I dug this up from a long time ago. This is from CNN Environment from 1995, where they also report that as dioxins become airborne, they travel thousands of miles away. And to your other point, that even at this point in time, they were finding that they in hamburgers and chicken and pizza from fast food restaurants, Pizza Hut, things like that, that they were finding up to 8 to 150 times above the level that was safe. It kind of blows my mind that it seems that they act like we don't know about this today. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Why this seems to be a conversation that was like dropped and put away when they seem to have been focusing on it around 95 to early 2000s? Just your thoughts.
My thoughts, and I mean, again, I've learned over and over again, do not underestimate the power of the corporations over the traditional media. All you got to do is take out some advertising on it. They're in it, and they're WKBN. I'll use their name. I believe that's the local station. They've become pro railroad, like everything's fine. And, this is the first time I guarantee you something's going on there, whether it's advertising or undue influence. The community doesn't deserve that. It doesn't deserve it at all.
That's very unfortunate. Go ahead.
And you hear stories. Now, I don't know what's true. It'd be fire chief's family, police chief, and all the donations going in, people's family members being hired by the railroad. I call that all undue influence. I'm not here to make moral or ethical judgments. All I have issues with that, but that's undue influence. And that's the problem in this country. And watch any TV. Not that I watch it much anymore, but commercials are all big pharma. Right. Is this playbook any different? I don't think so.
That's an important point too, that of course they're going to frame that as, well, we're trying to help the community. We're trying to give them jobs and but obviously you're right. I mean, all that does is then put their paycheck then depends on them not saying something that might put Norfolk Southern in bad light.
And the playbook is if they can get out of sight, out of mind, pay people. And then when people God forbid, they get cancer 3, 5, 7 years, it's going to be because, you smoked a cigarette in college or your lifestyle choices. It's not us. So that's very, very unfortunate. But the good news is people are really waking up.
Mm-hmm. Well, this brings to mind a point that I don't know if you're familiar with the Dark Horse podcast, but he put a point forward that I thought was really interesting. And this is just his opinion, but you can give me your thoughts on this, that he feels that there's been disasters like this in the past where they've learned from the fallout, that there's two things they could do. They can either take responsibility and maximize what they'll have to pay for it because they're saying, yep, we did this and we're going to deal with it. Or they could, and either way, they pretend to take some level of responsibility. Or what they could do is try to keep it under wraps, do their best to actually spread the problem as far as possible. So it becomes almost impossible to argue that it was because of the local area. They're like, let's same thing over there. And then as well as last out the time frame as long as possible. So like you said, it gets conflated with other things, life choices. Have you seen that in your experience dealing with these disasters?
Absolutely. I predicted ubiquitous in the environment before you saw it publicly. I'm on record on it. But that's why I've done the control. Again, the non-plume impacted. So I've already blown holes and called into question this ubiquitous in the environment narrative because we found 9 less dioxins in the fingerprint from the non-plume impacted or control area versus the plume impacted area.
Yeah. That's as clear as it gets. And I made this point about the concept of trying to play into this, the idea that going back to that CNN article, for example, that they were well aware of a pre-existing background problem. And so their argument, as you know, and they've said is, well, we're not going to test because, or even we did, it was just kind of what was already there. That seems like a very disingenuous answer. But even you're also pointing out that it was higher than that anyway. But it just seems like blatant corruption to me.
Yeah. And then, and then there's the dust. They're digging up the burn pits. People are continuing to have vinyl chloride in their urine. And again, that's my understanding. It should be out of your system in 24, 48 hours. So they're being repeatedly exposed.
How do you explain that, actually?
Well, what I am learning is, again, we're not seeing any testing. They have what high volume air devices. And they're not testing for what's in the dust. I talked to the EPA yesterday and I said, well, you need to test the dust because the dust can be a major problem in this when you're digging up the burn pits.
Well, in that regard, though,
and the other thing too is you see the railroad funded the street fair recently. They're funding June 11th, July 4th. They stop digging the burn pits and putting the dust in the air for these town events. Now, they must know something that we don't.
That's very telling.
And I was out there recently, and I across from Ground Zero testing a private business owners, and I can tell you that dust is an issue. And now here's another thing: the contract workers, the townspeople with all the dust, our government, the governor of Ohio, had no problem with mask mandates, right?
Hmm.
So
Right.
when you should have a mask mandate, there is none.
That's actually
So the question is, I don't think Governor DeWine, any of the elected officials, any of our agencies, do they really care about people's health? Where are the mask mandates when you need one?
God, that is such, well, just to be clear, and I'm sure you probably agree, I don't think government should ever be mandating any of these things. But what's funny is that you make such an excellent point that it's going to resonate with my audience so well that,
Oh,
go ahead.
for the record, I agree with you. I don't get it. This should not be about politics. I'm an independent and but I agree with you. I believe in individual choice. You
Oh
know,
yeah, I'm sure that was clear.
someone
I
wants
think.
to go into a radioactive area, that's their choice if they really want to do it.
Mhm. Right.
But
I
they
think
should,
that.
but if
Mhm.
our government started this mandate thing, they could at least suggest to people or strongly recommend. And I make that, point because of the pandemic and all these mask mandates as to, well, where's a mandate? If you ever might want to have a mandate, it would be for East Palestine when it
Right.
comes to masks.
Right. No, just to be clear, I'm sure that was clear for most people anyway. I just want to make sure that people didn't think that that's what you were suggesting. But so the point though is, again, that's going to resonate with my audience a lot because we've really been knocking down that illusion that their own studies. It's not statistically significant in reducing transmission. But the point is what we're talking about now are dust particles, which masks will be able to stop. And so that's a really interesting point that it's at a moment when it actually finally makes sense scientifically, they don't have anything to say about it. I think that right there alone is such an obvious point. But so back to unless you have any more thoughts on that, go ahead. But back to the dust itself. If I'm in regard to vinyl chloride, at least my minimal research, and I'm not an expert, shows that that's not something that should be lingering, right? Unless is it the dust that makes it
Yeah,
continue?
that's right. Something, if you're digging up Ground Zero every day, these people are being exposed every day to vinyl chloride and other chemicals, and they keep getting symptoms. So there is a source somewhere.
Right, right. That's
And
what I'm
you can't
interested.
find what you don't look for. If you don't test the dust particles, why can't I get a straight answer from the government agencies? Why aren't they testing the dust for dioxins? Well, you can't find what you don't look for. If you don't look for it, you don't have to report it. And you can say, oh, it's stress, it's mass psychosis. These symptoms are in your head.
Man, I mean, that's just absolutely wild. Well, since you're mentioning the symptoms, what have you been seeing and people on the ground and who you're talking to?
Well, there's like an epidemic, and I spoke about it recently in an interview, a week or so ago, but I had no idea until 10 days ago about the female issues. Very heavy menstrual cycles, clotting, pains, rashes, and none of this existed before. And it's like it's prevalent all over town, and even in some people that moved away, kids being affected. I mean, breathing issues, rashes on the face, and people having seizures.
Right. Well, in regard to the ones that, how many have you seen that are things that would be like, in my experience, I've seen veterinarians diagnosing animals with chemical poisoning or people getting what they actually call chemical bronchitis. Like, has that been something that is prominent?
I've seen some diagnoses like that, but here is talk about undue influence. You have very few doctors that will order tests but there are doctors that are growing awareness of this that are reviled, and they rule out. I've seen, obviously I have to protect residents because of HIPAA and their medical and health, but I've seen the chemical diagnosis from doctors, and I've seen where they're ruled out of every possible thing, infections, everything else. It has to be some form of chemical exposure. It's how and why. That's what we have to figure out.
Right, right. Well, this brings me to an interesting point that you already went into. And this is, and it's interesting you framed it this way because it does make a lot of sense. You talked about the previous disasters and how it was about the waste disposal kind of, racket, it seems. And there's a conversation to be had here in regard to clean harbors and all these different groups they're using. So I wanted your thoughts on this. First, on just your general perspective on how that might be playing the same factor in this disaster, but whether or not these areas they're shipping to even have the ability to deal with the things that we know are in the disaster, the dioxins, the PFAS, things like that.
I won't, the name, you just recently used a name. I won't say the name, but I was told point blank, we'll never use in remediation, we'll never use your technology. We own the landfills. We make our money by not getting the oil out. We don't want the oil out of the water quickly.
Man.
So once the remediation is a huge business, and a lot of these investment groups that are demanding ESG and sustainability, they all own these companies. And you could do getting the word out and educating people about all this. But again, the remediation ends up to be an annuity stream for a few corporations. The power of their lobbyists and PR people are not to be underestimated.
Yeah, and it's an incredible thing to realize this for some people, but we've talked about this in just voting in general, but the lobbyists, the moneyed interests, it's provable that we live in essentially in an oligarchy in this country where they have complete control to make things happen or not happen based on their influence. And the average voter, if has any influence at all, it's a different discussion, is clearly, I think it was a Princeton study that basically found that I think it was near zero, minuscule effect on the outcome of policy just in our voting process. And that's kind of what you're talking about, but the specific part of these kind of lobbyists. But for that note, since we're, talking about it, I think what I'm getting at with this is Clean Harbor seems to be a clear focus for a lot of this. And I've talked, and I would play them, but they're about 10 minutes long, and I'd rather take the time to speak to you more. But I spoke to them on the phone. I called both of these locations, or three of them technically, and by their own testimony, they do not have the ability to deal with the dioxins. They're not even doing incinerators. They're burying this stuff in landfills for the most part. And that's dioxins or PFAS. They're not able to do it. And so it just kind of shows you that there's maybe it's what you're saying. This is a allowance to continue the problem, or it could just be profiteering, knowing that they don't want to expose what it happened. I mean, either way, it's corrupt. It's criminal. And it's spreading the problem around like we were talking about earlier.
I wasn't aware until you. Clean Harbors is involved in East Palestine?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Clean Harbors is three different times they've shipped to three different locations. I've called on these and spoken to them directly, and most of them don't even have incinerators they're using, but even the ones that do are telling them that they're not even using that, and they're doing different treatments. And so on the record, they're telling us they're claiming they have no discussion about dioxins. They're not even being told that's what's in this, even though we know that it is. And so they're spreading this around by not treating it properly. And that's all very clearly on the record, but I don't know if you want to comment or not, but I think that's an important part of this.
None of that is surprising to me. I've seen it before. I've been so focused on trying to help figure out the health issues and what people are being exposed to. I haven't looked into that, but that's great that you looked into that.
Well, I'll definitely send you some.
I do think, though, I can tell you from the calls that I get from government agencies and all my social media being monitored, the fear. Here's the good news. East Palestine's a turning point, because I've never seen so much support come and people come together from all walks of life. It's very important. The way that the average, honest, hardworking, tax-paying American citizen, which is probably 90% of the population or more, the way that a lot of this corruption can be called out and defeated is coming together in places like Twitter and social media, because I can tell you that's what the government fears. That's what all these people fear. And the funny thing is, we were told follow the science, but they fear the science. Right. They actually fear the science.
I completely agree. And really what they meant was follow the narrative, right? And we are the science, as Fauci made very clear, right? So that's the whole point, is kind of just follow what you're told, but yeah, I think this is clear. It's a lot of engineering, social engineering, and keeping people in when the facts on the ground make this undeniable. And so I think you're right. I think that there's a lot of concern here that when people come together, that they will be able to make something shift. And obviously one thing I always say here is vote with your dollar. We see that being a real concept today. And that's Norfolk Southern, anybody else, that your dollar matters more than anything else to them. So that's how you should make a difference if you can. But let's go ahead and talk about the environmental impacts and how you think this is going to go forward. I mean, obviously you're predicting, I mean, you don't have a crystal ball, but with what you're seeing on the ground, right? The numbers that you're seeing, and not even getting into the unknown combinations and what that might be doing. What do you see happening here for these people? Especially in 4 months, they're still getting sick.
They're going to have to, the soil, and it really needs to be thoroughly analyzed. What needs to be done? I think they need an option to be able to sell at, maybe they take appraised value for the homes and 2 times, 1.5 times, and the railroad buys them out. I mean, I think it would be far cheaper for the railroad to do the right thing and also, stabilize or preserve reputation. But instead, when they hire all these consultants and PR people to run the show and undermine the community, that's just that, it's not going to work. It's not going to work in East Palestine.
And they hired the classic company off the top of my head. I can't remember. You might remember that was involved with the EPA and many other cover-ups of the past that are even openly called as such by the corporate media today. And on that same note, EPA famously lied about the safety of after 9/11, right? So there's all these very clear overlaps to that, and how it's kind of a institutional problem, captured agency kind of a reality.
That's right. There's captured agencies and captured media. Let there be no doubt about it.
Right.
That's why the PR people are hired for so much money. They go out and they capture the media and they capture the agencies. But
yeah, absolutely. On the note of the land discussion, a lot of people are, and rightly so, are very concerned about that discussion in general. Some people even argue that might have been the entire reason this happened. I clearly think that this is more of a classic cover-up, and that might be just a byproduct of it. But either way, Norfolk Southern is already showing that it doesn't want, on the record now, like trying to dismiss these lawsuits, and we can go into that in a second, but that they're buying the property out from under them. It's clear that it won't be full value. I think they've already kind of insinuated that more than once. But do you think that there's a dynamic there? Like this is an important area in regard to like food chain, that kind of stuff. So any thoughts on there maybe being a dishonest tactic in there and trying to, sweep this up?
Yeah, I mean, I think I saw that language about making up the difference, and no one knows what there's all kinds of games, Yeah. They have unlimited money and battalions of statisticians, and they can basically manipulate any form of data, whether it's testing results or real estate values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we'll have to wait and see, obviously, but I'm not going to begrudge anybody from wanting to get the hell out of there and wanting to, be somewhat compensated, hopefully more than their house is worth, which is what even Congress was pushing. But I honestly don't think that's going to come to pass. And we could finish by talking about this, which I really think is an important kind of follow-up to this, which is, and this is what I was just mentioning. This is the New Republic, I think, but I've seen this in plenty of places. Norfolk Southern files motion to dismiss the lawsuit over the Ohio derailment, it's just such an insulting reality. And just to quickly read a couple points, then you can comment on this. It says the rail giant is looking to dismiss the mass class action lawsuit. For those who don't know, that means the individuals who they claim they're going to take care of are suing them collectively, and they're trying to stop that. It says Norfolk Southern is seeking to shut down the case, which is in fact a consolidation of over 30 separate lawsuits filed against the company by individuals. Quote, the first car to derail, this is Norfolk Southern speaking, did not belong to Norfolk Southern. Nor did Norfolk Southern construct the wheel bearing that allegedly overheated, and caused the train to derail. And it goes on to say, in the motion, Norfolk Southern's lawyers labored to argue the plaintiff's array of claims fell short. And then they even have the nerve to mention their millions of dollars in financial aid. So give me your thoughts on that. And we can, there's a lot of things we can comment on in that discussion.
That's just a follow up on the PR playbook. So first of all, we're not responsible. But we stepped in and supported the community and the town fair and all, and we donated here and there. We're the good guys. We're not responsible. Go sue someone else.
It's just so insulting to our intelligence. I mean, that breaks down just taking the population of the town. That's like assuming it was $5 million, which I don't know what the exact amount is. And maybe it's more than that, but still $5 million, that's $1,050 a person, so clearly that doesn't even begin to be seen as supporting these people, and so it's just really frustrating. And overall, what they're doing is just like you said, passing the buck, acting like we didn't, we're required to carry vinyl chloride. And actually, if you could comment for me on the wheel bearing point, it's interesting they would say allegedly, right? Are they now starting to suggest that that's not what actually happened? What do you think?
I think that's more of leaving the door open where they can point the finger and blame the manufacturer of the wheel bearing or other components for the failure and not themselves.
Oh, I agree with that. But the fact that I think it's pretty clear, at least the narrative is that the wheel bearing overheated. They have the readings of the different temperatures. So I find it odd that they would say allegedly overheated. I'm just wondering whether they're trying to start a narrative or set something about, like blaming something else, or maybe that's more going on there. I don't know.
I think they're leaving the door open to blame something else, and that's the lawyer speak, where even when
Yeah.
the criminal killed somebody, they're still the alleged criminal until the trial happens.
Yeah, fair enough. But yeah, overall, I think it's very clear to anybody with two brain cells to rub together, anybody honest that can see that they're playing political games when people's lives are on the line. People are getting sick. Scott's been testing. You have levels that are far above what we are being told is safe. Combination of things we don't even know what's going to happen in that regard, and actively telling it they're trying to turn down the lawsuits of people that need help. Right. So where do you see this going forward, and what are you going to be doing next in the future? And,
well, we're going to organize sometime probably in later June or July, where I'm waiting for more test results to come in, and we're going to probably have another community meeting where we can talk about the results and also have the medical doctor that I'm involved with take questions, and maybe by then she'll have some, results in from blood testing. So there's a lot of evolving moving parts. It's just that we're staying in constant communication. And again, it's about following the science, following the logic. None of these symptoms being reported were ubiquitous in the community health prior to the derailment. It's that simple. That's really all you need to know.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Well, I really appreciate all your work there. I know your work is very important, ongoing, and I hope people will follow that. Let me know when you're doing these public meetings, and maybe I'll even fly out. I'd love to be there.
We'd love to have you there. We'd love to have you broadcasting it from there.
Yeah,
I'll be in touch, Ryan.
Outstanding. Well, thank you again. Anything else you want to leave us with? Your social media links, upcoming events?
Yeah, just the best way to reach me is on Twitter at Water Warrior 1 ONE. So
outstanding. All right. Well, we'll be touching base and going forward. And thank you for your work, Scott. It's important.
Right.
And
Thanks.
as always, everybody out there, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.